So let's talk a little bit about Nietzsche's general project. What is he up to in his works as a whole? And this is something that is extremely contentious. Some people think there is no unifying thread to his philosophy, that he is just more or less a rabid dog, just biting and barking at everybody who goes by. But I don't think that's true. I think that there is a thread that runs through all of his thought, which is quite coherent, even if you think that it's wrong. In fact, this is actually the thing I'm probably most sympathetic to in all of his works, is when he talks about nihilism. So if you have the study guide out in front of you, again, remember that there are terms in our short essay questions at the bottom, so we're going to be talking about nihilism. That is there on the sheet. So I want to say that Nietzsche's project, what he is about, is he is warring against nihilism. He is attacking nihilism. That's what he's doing. A lot of people say that Nietzsche is a nihilist, unless they mean something very specific, then they're just wrong. There is a very specific technical way in which I get what they're saying, and there's some truth to it. But speaking in just general terms, no, he is not a nihilist. He is attacking nihilism. That's what his entire philosophy is about. So he wants to attack nihilism, and what he is championing, so rather than just purely stating it negatively, which is, we're going to talk about what nihilism is, but he is attacking nihilism. What he wants to champion is something the philosophers have called life affirmation. So that's, I think, the kind of the two terms that you need to have in order to understand his philosophy in general, is that he is opposed to nihilism and that he is for life affirmation. So what is nihilism? If you're familiar with the term, if it was like a vocab term in high school, you might know, or just reading around culture, it comes up with this term thrown around a lot. In contemporary culture, it means something like the idea that there is no meaning at all in life, right? That everything is just meaningless. In fact, if you've read the book of the Bible, Ecclesiastes, that is essentially a nihilistic text, which is interesting, that is in the Bible. But the writer of the book says, the constant refrain of that book is, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. It's in the Bible, yeah. You should read the Bible, it's really interesting. That is a nihilistic way of thinking in this kind of broad cultural sense. Nietzsche means something, I think, a little bit more specific. It would take us a long time to get into the intricacies of what exactly he means, because it's kind of like an organic concept, and you have to understand the kind of historical progression. So I'm going to cut through the tree hole. Is that a thing? Yeah, I think so. I'm going to, try to short circuit a lot of that and just give you something that you can kind of commit to memory. So what Nietzsche means by nihilism is slightly different than I think of what people mean in common parlance, because Nietzsche says things like, Christianity is a form of nihilism. He says this. He says Christianity is a form of nihilism. Says it very clearly. And so if you think that nihilism is just kind of the contemporary parlance view of nihilism, that everything is meaningless, do Christians believe that everything is meaningless? Like, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't quite match on to what Nietzsche is saying then. So what Nietzsche is saying when he talks about nihilism, again, this is a little bit of a simplification, but I think it's much more helpful to understand what he was trying to say. He thinks that nihilism is the view that there is nothing of value in the here and now. That there's nothing of value in the here and now. Right? This is why Christianity, he thinks, is a form of nihilism. Christians don't think that there's no meaning anywhere. They believe that there's like an afterlife and God and things like this. But that's kind of Nietzsche's point, is that they think that the real meaning and value and significance of life is like after you die or something like that. Right? There's no meaning here. There's no meaning on this earth. The whole purpose of your life is to like leave here and go somewhere else and be with God and whatever, heaven and resurrection or whatever, that religion's got going on. But not here. Right? And so Nietzsche says that Christianity is essentially saying no to life. And so this, I think, is a helpful way of thinking about nihilism for Nietzsche, is that nihilism is a way of saying no to life, a way of saying no to the here and now. What I mean by saying no is like kind of turning your face away from the here and now and saying, no, this is not valuable, this is not significant, right? Real significance is somewhere else. And Nietzsche wants to say that's a kind of nihilism. Nietzsche doesn't believe in heaven or reincarnation or anything like that. He doesn't believe in these kinds of things. He thinks that this world is all that there is. And so if you have Christians or Buddhists or members of other religious traditions saying that this world sucks and the whole point is to go somewhere, is to be somewhere else, that is a kind of nihilism from his perspective, because Christians and Buddhists and other religious believers are saying no to the only reality that there is. They're saying no to life. Right? He similarly thinks that Plato is a kind of nihilist, because Plato says, real truth is up in the forms. Remember we talked about this earlier in the semester, where there's like essentially two realities. There's the immaterial world of the forms, and then there's this physical world, which is at best an imitation of the real world. And Nietzsche thinks that's a kind of nihilistic view, because it's saying that this world sucks, it's degenerate, it's secondary, and he thinks that there is no realm of the forms. So all that you're saying is you're shitting on life in the here and now. That's what Plato is doing, that's what Christians are doing, that's what Buddhists are doing, that's what Muslims are doing. He thinks that all of these people are guilty of saying no to life in the here and now. So they are all nihilistic. Right? What Nietzsche wants to juxtapose nihilism with, so he tries to attack nihilism, and he wants to say that there is meaning and value in the here and now, but it's not given by God, it's something that we have to create, it's something we have to do ourselves. That's what he is trying to say. So we have to make this meaning. Again, you might even be able to tell that Nietzsche has been profoundly influential, not only on like the political and philosophical left, but just now is seeped into just culture in general. I mean, we're really kind of living in Nietzsche's wake, because he was the person who was saying that the only meaning in life that there is one that you create. You're like, oh, that's what I think. It's like, yeah, the reason why you think that is because Nietzsche was saying this 140 years ago. That's why you think this now. It's because he's the guy who came up with this idea and has influenced all of these other thinkers, and now it's permeated culture. Right? So he wants to champion life affirmation. He'd say if nihilism is a way of saying no to life, life affirmation is a way of saying yes to life. So forms of nihilism, you've got Christianity, you've got Buddhism, you've got Platonism. I think we would put like Islam, almost all the forms of traditional religion, I think he would put into this camp of being nihilist. Also, he would put like liberal toleration. I think he would put that as a kind of nihilism. It's a way of saying no. It's a way of saying that things don't really matter. What does that mean? Well, we say things like we're like relativists. We're like liberal. We believe in liberal toleration. We would say you have your ideas and I have my ideas, and your ideas are just as good as mine, right? We might disagree, but your ideas are just as good as mine. Everybody has their own ideas about things. Who's to say? And that's a kind of liberal toleration. And Nietzsche would say that is in fact a kind of nihilism. That is just another way of saying if you have different ideas than another person and you say that those person's ideas are just as good as your own, that's just a way of saying that you don't give a shit about your own ideas. You don't care about anything. You're a kind of nihilist. Think of an analogy. That's like saying, the Philadelphia Eagles, they're my team. I love the Philadelphia Eagles, but Dallas Cowboys fans, that's fine, right? Dallas Cowboys are just as good as the Eagles. No, if you think that the Dallas Cowboys are just as good as the Eagles, that means you don't give a shit about the Eagles. Because part of what it is to be an Eagles fan is to hate the Dallas Cowboys, right? You all know that. Yeah, I know that you know that, right? So if you say that if you claim to be an Eagles fan and say that the Dallas Cowboys are just as good, it's just as good to be a fan of the Dallas Cowboys, that means that you don't give a shit about the Eagles. You don't actually care, right? So liberal toleration, the idea that all ideas are equal, your ideas are just as good as mine, he thinks is a kind of nihilism. It's a way of saying that you don't think anything matters. Because if you thought that stuff matters, you'd have a kind of like combative attitude, a warlike attitude towards people who think differently than you, and you'd be willing to fight with them, right? Maybe not literally, maybe literally, but at least in terms of like the concept of ideas, this is really what he wants. He has a kind of agonistic view. Agon is a Greek word, it means like struggle, right? He has an agonistic view about culture, about politics, these kinds of things. He wants people to struggle with one another. He is actually in favor of kind of quasi-militarism. Again, you can see why the Nazis made use of him. But he wants general kind of struggle. He thinks that different cultures again should produce different kinds of art, different kinds of music, and they should champion their own kind of thing. And they think it's the best, right? That's what it is to be a fan of country music. Is to think that it's the best kind of music. And if you like other kinds of music, you just don't really get it, right? Like this person, this artist, whatever, is better than all the others, and he wants there to be a kind of contest of values, right? Because he thinks if people really care about stuff, then there's going to be tension between them and people who disagree with them, right? So he thinks if you like rock, then you should think that people who think country is the best, you should think they're full of shit. Doesn't mean that you should like kill them or something like this. He doesn't think that actually. Again, not because he's nice, but because he thinks that you like need enemies. He thinks that actually makes you better, right? The Dallas Cowboys, the hatred of the Dallas Cowboys will inspire the Eagles to be better, right? That's kind of what he thinks. He thinks that he wants there to be a contest of values values, that you come up with what you think is valuable, the way that you want to live, your kind of life that you want to live, and you should champion that. You should think it's the best. And if people tell you you're wrong, you should want to beat them, right? Not get rid of them, but beat them, right? So think of like jazz band competitions or sports, right? The idea is not that you like want to kill your opponents, it's that you want to one up them, right? You want to do it better. That's the idea. So that's actually what the agon in Greek was from. My understanding is originally it was like they would have almost like jazz band competitions, but with plays, with tragedy, with things like this. So different playwrights would put on different plays, and then the people would vote which one was best. And so the idea is, that kind of competition makes you want to double down on your own craft and to do it even better next time. You're like, oh, I got third place. Like I hate it when so and so beats me. That stinks. And it's like, oh, but I know that he's gonna be back at the festival next year. I'm gonna kick his ass. I'm gonna wipe the floor with him, right? And that's gonna give you this kind of impetus, right? That kind of struggle, that kind of like anger, that energy. Nietzsche wants people to bring that out because that shows that you care, right? And it also is gonna make you better, and that's what gives your life meaning and value. Is you bringing forth this kind of new beauty, artistic beauty. And here I do think that Nietzsche is at least onto something, even if he's wrong about how this should be done or different kinds of things like that. He thinks that it's important that people care about things, and he thinks that struggle makes people better. I'm not exactly sure about the struggle makes people better kind of thing. But he's also famous for the phrase, you probably heard this phrase, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. That's one of that's a kind of paraphrase of his view, but that is definitely from Nietzsche. I believe it's from Twilight of the Idols, one of his works. And so he does think that competition makes us better, that kind of thing. And so he wants what he wants. And if you associate nothing else with Nietzsche, I want you to associate this phrase, life affirmation. This is his deal. He wants people to say yes to life, to embrace life, because there's no preset meaning in the universe, right? He thinks that this idea that God made the universe and tells us what's valuable and what's not, that's all bullshit, and we can really no longer believe it anymore. We're going to talk more about the death of God here in a minute. But instead, what we need to do is we need to decide for ourselves what is valuable. And so we need to find something. Each of us need to find something that gives our life meaning, something we can devote ourselves to, and that gets us through life and makes us want to move forward. And so sometimes when he gets into these kind of poetic mindsets, when he talks about saying yes to life, and he can actually say some kind of profound and beautiful things. So at the end of the section here, I'm just going to read you a little passage from Nietzsche. And so this is from a book called The Gay Science, or The Joyful Science. And this is section 276. So you can look that up, The Gay Science, section 276. And this is what he writes. He's writing about a new year. This is almost like his New Year's resolution, which is kind of cool to be able to read Nietzsche's New Year's resolution. So he writes, for the new year, I still live, I still think. I still have to live, for I still have to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. Is he referring to there? Should be able to pick this up by now. Who's he referring to? Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. He's referring to René Descartes, right? And he continues, today everybody permits himself the expression of his wish, the new year, and his dearest thought. Hence I too shall say what it is that I wish from myself today, and what was the first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. And this is, I think, that the important passage. He says, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love henceforth. That means love of fate. So he's saying, I want to learn to love the world. Basically, I want to learn to love what has happened in my life. This is what he's saying. I want to learn to love what is necessary. Not to say no to things, even in my own life. This is what he's saying. Not to say no to the world, because it's the only reality there is. And I don't want to hate the only reality there is. I want to learn to love it. That's what he's saying. Then he continues, I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. It's really a brilliant and beautiful passage. So he's saying, I want to learn to say yes to what is necessary. And he thinks that pretty much whatever happens is necessary. He only wants to learn to say yes, to embrace anything that's happened, even the things that's happened in his own life, even the kinds of things that ordinarily some people want to say no to. And we're going to come back to this idea when he talks about eternal recurrence. And he thinks one of the kind of the tasks of life is to learn to embrace what has happened to you in your life and to not to say no to your own life. But I think it's interesting that he says, I don't even want to say no to people anymore. And if you read him, you realize that he actually spends nearly all of his time saying no. He hardly ever says yes. But it is interesting to note what he says no to. What does he say no to? He tends to say no to things that he believes are nihilistic, which is to say, he wants to say no to no-sayers. If you know even a little bit of logic, you might realize that that's a double negation. He is contradicting. He is saying no to no. And if you say no to no, that's a way of saying yes. So I think that it's interesting that Nietzsche does spend all of his time saying no, but he says no to people who themselves say no to life. And so I think that's indirectly his way of saying yes to life. So that's what Nietzsche is actually about. He is about life affirmation. And that should be the kernel of your understanding, cornerstone of your understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy. And that should color everything that we discuss going forward. All right. Here we go. Let's talk about the most controversial thing that we're going to talk about with Nietzsche, I think by a wide margin. So let's talk about his ideas about ethics. So remember, Nietzsche is going to be our bridge between thinking about ethics and Kant and Mill, and also the meaning of life. So we've already talked a little bit about nihilism and the problem of meaninglessness. So we see why Nietzsche cares about these kinds of things. But now we're going to talk a little bit about what he says about morality. And what he says is pretty rough, right? So again, not a nice guy. So what he does in many of his works, he wrote 2 works specifically on ethics, but then this is the kind of theme that comes up through everything that he does, is he wants to do what's called a genealogy of morality, what he calls a genealogy of morality. And so you might be familiar with genealogies, like genealogy.com, right? It's like your family tree, it's where you came from. That's kind of the idea, right? So like you do these genealogy things, and like here is you, and it's like, here are your parents, and then like here are your mom's grandparents, not your mom's parents, your grandparents, your mom's parents, and your dad's parents, and you can just go back in the past and see where you came from. And so Nietzsche's going to do the same thing with morality. He wants to say, where did morality come from? He wants to do a genealogy of morality and try to show you that it is that it actually came from somewhere, that it's like historically contingent, that it's like the product of historical forces, just like you are. Like if your parents hadn't met, then you wouldn't be here, this kind of thing. People like Kant think that traditional morality, like think like the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, these kinds of things, right? Don't steal, don't lie, that kind of stuff. Kant thinks that kind of morality, like those these ideas that are in traditional morality, he thinks they have to be the way that they are, right? We talked about this. Like you can't even imagine a world that's different, where there's a different morality. And Nietzsche's basically like, hold my beer, right? Because he wants to say not only can morality be different, but in fact in the past it was different. And then the implication is if it was different in the past, it could be different again in the future. And this is what Nietzsche wants to do. He wants to show that our way of thinking about traditional morality is a product of historical forces, and that it used to be different in the past, and it could be different again in the future. And that's what he wants society to undergo what he calls a revaluation of all values. He wants society to reconsider how we think about right and wrong and good and bad, because there are different ways of thinking about it. This is what he's convinced of. All right, so let's do this. All right, so Nietzsche basically wants to say that morality was different in the past, and when he talks about this, he's kind of channeling the kind of like Roman culture is generally what he's thinking about, and he wants to say that. Let's start here. He wants to say that there are generally 2 kinds of people in the world. That there are both now and in the past. There are generally 2 kinds of people. There are what he calls masters, and there are what he calls slaves. And here when he talks about masters and slaves, he is not talking about racial categories. Again, I'm not saying he's nice, I'm not whitewashing him. He's just not talking about racial categories. He wants to say that even within any culture, within any ethnicity, there are some people who are masters and there are other people who are slaves. Here he is channeling to some extent Aristotle, who we're going to be talking about next. We're not going to talk about this aspect of Aristotle's thought, but Aristotle thought that some people are natural masters and some people are naturally slaves. To put it in less, provocative terms, Nietzsche's trying to be provocative in using these terms. Like he realizes that these terms are upsetting. That's part of why he uses them. But Aristotle, to put Aristotle's thought in a less provocative way, he thinks that some people are born to lead and some people are born to follow. Some people are born to be masters, some people are born to be slaves. Right? That's kind of what he's saying. Some people are born to lead, some people are born to follow. Nietzsche uses that distinction, but then develops it in his own kind of distinctive way. So he wants to say that there are some people who are masters. These are essentially people who embrace life. These are people who are strong, who are energetic, who are vital, who like life. It's almost like people who say yes to life. Those are the masters, right? These are people who are, they can get shit done, right? They're powerful, they know what to do, they're strong, they're intelligent, they have the kind of capacities that if they want something, they can get it done, right? Then there are people he thinks are slaves, and people who are slaves are people who are opposite. They're weak, they're ineffective, right? Even when they want something, they can't get it done, right? They can't get what they want because they're weak and ineffective, right? So Nietzsche thinks a lot of this is grounded in our psychophysiology, like in our physical, physiological, and psychological selves. So he thinks it's the people who are strong tend to like life. Why? Because they can get what they want, right? Like people like LeBron James, like he would be like a kind of master, right? According to Nietzsche's way of thinking, because he does whatever the hell he wants. He's like a freak of nature in terms of his size. He's like 6'9", 265 pounds, and can run like an effing gazelle. Like what the hell is up with that, right? He can do what he wants, right? Also, great artists Nietzsche would think would be kind of like masters, this kind of thing. People who are in control, who are strong. They're physiologically healthy people. These people tend to embrace life. They tend to be creative. They tend to like life. Slaves are people who are just like sick and unwell. They're physiologically weak, and that makes them psychologically unhealthy, is what Nietzsche thinks. People who are weak tend to be drawn to nihilistic philosophies. They tend to be like Christians, for goodness sakes, right? This is what Nietzsche's like, right? But why? Because Christianity says no to life. Christianity is like, yeah, life sucks here, but it'll be better somewhere else. And the slaves are like, oh, good, right? Because yeah, everything sucks here. I suck. This sucks. People are always pushing me around. I can't get what I want. I want to date this person, get this job, and I can't do them. Like I can't do this stuff. I'm not good enough, right? And so Christianity's like, yeah, that's because stuff here sucks. And so they tend to be weak physiologically, and that makes them weak psychologically and drawn to nihilistic, life-hating philosophies and religions. And so masters aren't like that. They tend to look down on Christianity, look down on Buddhism. They just do what they want, right? Because they're strong. Okay, so part and parcel of this, because there's these two categories of people, Nietzsche thinks that they're drawn to very different ways of thinking, and therefore develop different kinds of morality. And here he is kind of channeling Roman ways of living. So in Roman culture, they were literally like the masters of the household, paterfamilias kind of person versus the guy who's in charge, and then there's like everybody else, like the literal slaves, but also like the rest of the household. And in that culture, like the masters could just do whatever the f they wanted to. The head of the household could do whatever they wanted to. Nobody else really could, right? But they could have, they have their wives, they can have sex with their wives. They could also take sexual advantage of their slaves, both male and female. They just do whatever the hell they wanted to do. Incidentally, historically, and Nietzsche is cognizant of this, Christianity changed a lot of this. When Christianity came in, women were expected to remain faithful to their husbands, but husbands were not expected to remain faithful to their wives. The husbands could just do whatever they wanted to. If they wanted to sleep with a temple prostitute or sleep with a slave in the household, whatever, it's their own damn business. If the wife wanted to, no. Then Christianity comes on the scene. You have people like St. Paul saying that the same rules that we apply to women, we should also apply to men. And the Romans were like, you're kidding, right? And the Christians were like, no. Morality is universal. It's the same for everybody. And the Romans were like, you're shitting me. Like, no, it's not. Yeah, this is kind of what Nietzsche is talking about. So, because there are two different kinds of people, Nietzsche thinks that historically there were two different kinds. Historically, there have been two different kinds of morality, right? So not only could there be different kinds of morality, Kant is wrong, he thinks, but there have been different kinds of morality. So he thinks there's what he calls master morality, and then there's what he calls slave morality. Slave morality is kind of like traditional morality. We're gonna come back to it in a second. So think like the moral commandments, the 10 commandments. Don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, that kind of stuff. Don't commit murder. That's the stuff you're familiar with. You're familiar with slave morality, and the reason for that is because Nietzsche believes that slave morality has taken over the globe right now, but didn't used to always be this way. Master morality is more foreign to us, and it's harder to understand. But in part because it's not universal. So master morality maintains that there are different kinds of people and that the same rules do not apply to everybody, right? Different strokes for different folks. It's kind of like master morality. So masters believe that the rules that apply to masters, the rules that apply to slaves don't apply to masters. For example, masters do what they want, right? So master morality is kind of like whatever a master decides is good, and whatever a master decides is bad, right? So it's kind of like they decide what's good or bad. Right? It's not that God doesn't say, like, it's like humans decide. It's like these strong people, they decide what's good or bad, right? And so masters, because they are strong and vital and energetic, they will praise and call good anything that is like them, anything that is life-giving, anything that is energetic, anything that is vital, anything that is strong, they will call good. And they'll call things that are bad, not wicked, mind you, bad. Things that are like lower class, things that are like despicable, things that are sick or cowardly or dishonest, these kinds of things. They just like they don't condemn it, they just kind of like turn their face away from it and like look down on it. It's like, oh, that's, like if you're walking down the street and you see something gross on the sidewalk, you're just like, oh, I'm just gonna ignore that, right? That's kind of how the masters would treat anything they regard as bad. They don't condemn it and they're like, I condemn you to hell. They're not like that. They're just like, oh goodness, that made me gross, like take it out of the way kind of thing. And so this is kind of how masters are. They regard other masters, for example, as strong and vital, and so they approve of them. They give kind of respect to one another, right? There's a kind of respectful deference amongst masters, right? So you can imagine, like almost like two lions going by the edges of their territory, where they meet, the edges of the two territories meet, and two lions kind of like passing one another, being like, I see you, I respect you. You stay over there, I'll stay over here. I see you. We're equals. Like I respect you. Masters and slaves, though, not equals, right? This is what's so foreign about master morality is that Nietzsche is saying in the past, and this seems to historically be true, up until a couple hundred years ago, people did not believe in human equality. A lot of that is because of Christianity sweeping the globe and convincing people that everybody is equal before God. Before that, people did not believe this. This is why when we talked about Mary Midgley and trying out one through sword, and we want to ask when the samurai cuts the wayfarer, the peasant in half, we want to ask, is the peasant okay with this? They wouldn't have given a shit. That's not true just of Japanese culture, but of European culture. The kings didn't give a shit what the peasants fought. They just like send them off to war, whatever. They don't care if they complain. They're like peons. They're peasants. Nobody cares if they consent to it. It wasn't until Christianity gives birth to kind of like liberal ideas, and then people start believing in human equality. Once that comes into play, then people start caring about consent. Then people are like, oh, we're moral equal, so I can't do something to you unless you are okay with it, because I'm not like superior to you. We're on a par, and so I can't like whatever command you to do something unless you have agreed to it. But before that, people didn't believe this. People were like, no, I can command you because like I'm the king, or I'm like a noble person, and you're like a peasant. So like you do what I say, right? There's a hierarchy here. And so in the past, Nietzsche says people believe in hierarchies. Nietzsche himself is a fan of hierarchies. Again, he's not a particularly nice person. He thinks some people are in fact better than other people. He would say LeBron James is in fact superior to Patrick Casey. That is not like, they are not morally equal, right? They're not equally valuable. And he's like, the economy, if nothing else, would tell you that. Like LeBron James is going to be probably the first sports billionaire, and Patrick is. He's not. Anyway, and so people want to say, oh no, of course they're equal because they both have souls or something. And he's just like, no, you're just playing make believe. Like you're talking about these things that don't exist in order to try to flatten out the difference between LeBron James and Patrick Casey because you don't want to accept the reality. And the reality is that LeBron James is superior to Patrick. Like, that's reality. You should say yes to life. You should embrace reality. Reality is not nice. It's not what you want it to be, but it is what it is, and you should learn to embrace it and to say yes to it, not hide your head in the sand and try to create equalities where there aren't any. Right? This is Nietzsche. Okay? Yeah. And he's like, the Romans at least knew this. They knew that some people were better than others, and they lived that way. So the masters could do whatever they wanted to do. If a slave, a lower class, whatever, commoner, had a horse or something, the master could just take it. Right? If they affirm, like, yes, this horse is vital, this horse is energetic, just like me, we belong together, just take the horse. Is that stealing? Nietzsche would say no, because they're not equals. Yeah? So imagine me with my dog. Again, this is not nice. Imagine me with my dog. I give my dog a bone sometimes, and then afterwards, he's on for a while, but I gotta watch his weight, so at some point I'll take the bone away. I don't ask him. I take it away. Am I stealing from my dog? I gave him a gift and now I'm taking it back? No, I'm not stealing from my dog. Why? Because it's a dog. Right? He's like below me, so I can do what I want within reason with the dog. We even accept this today. Nietzsche's saying that this used to be the case. People used to think this about humans too. That some people are above other humans, and they're not responsible. There's no reciprocity here, at least not a symmetrical one. And so, just like, that would be weird for me to do that with a person where I give them a gift and after all I'm like, that's enough, I take it back. You'd be like, what's the matter with you? Because now we believe in human equality. But Nietzsche's saying in the past it didn't. So masters do not recognize human equality, and so they do not believe in universal human values. Right? They do not believe that it's always wrong to steal or to lie or whatever. It depends. Right? It would be maybe wrong to lie to a master because there's a kind of equality between masters and you should respect them. And respecting somebody means being frank with them. It means being forthright and speaking the truth. I think Nietzsche would say something like that. He thinks there's some value in being forthright and being honest and straightforward. But masters don't own anything to the slaves. They can do whatever they want with them, like bodily, including bodily. They can do what they want with them. And so there's this original distinction in master morality where masters call whatever is good and vital and energetic, anything that's like them, they approve of it and they say that that's good. And anything that's beneath them, they kind of turn their face away or maybe kick it away if it's like a slave and get away from you, disease, vermin, vermin, that kind of thing. But anything that's below them they regard as is bad, not as wicked. They don't condemn things that are below them. They just turn their face away. Okay, so that's master morality. A little bit difficult to wrap your head around, but yes, I think maybe thinking of Roman culture is helpful. Okay, then secondly, we have slave morality. Slave morality is much easier to understand, so we can do this a lot faster. Slave morality is the morality that you're familiar with. It's universal morality. Do not commit murder, do not steal. The same rules apply to everybody, right? If you're gonna, whatever, you can't make use of another person. You can't use somebody as a means to an end, simply as a means to an end. If you're going to use them to style your hair or for them to make you a sandwich, you have to compensate them. You have to pay them because there's human equality. There's a kind of reciprocity, right? Do as you would be done by, this kind of thing, because all human beings are equal. This is slave morality. And so Nietzsche thinks that slaves, of course, weak people are drawn to this way of thinking, right? Slave morality says that like pity is a good thing. Nietzsche says that pity is like the worst thing. He says that pity is essentially making suffering contagious. Where it's like you're suffering and now I'm suffering because I have pity for you, so I feel bad for you. Nietzsche's like, don't do that, right? But slave morality says that pity is good. Slave morality says that charity is good. Who benefits from charity? Is it the strong people or is it the weak people? Of course, it's the weak people, right? So slave morality is essentially self-serving. The idea is that slave morality is supposed to be charity, it's supposed to be loving, but in fact, he says slave morality, what it is a hatred of anything that's superior. Holy cow, right? So he says the idea impetus behind slave morality is not love. Yeah, the hatred, what lies behind slave morality is in fact hatred of anything that's superior. So the desire of slave morality is to flatten out hierarchies, right? Where LeBron James is up here and I'm down here, I will be resentful of that. And he says slave morality begins in, well, he uses a French term, resentment, right? Hopefully I'm saying that right. But it's something like resentment, right? Where the idea is that the slaves don't like being, run over by the masters. And so basically what they do is they come together and they develop their own idea of morality where everybody is equal before God, that kind of thing. And it's a way of bringing down people who are superior, people like LeBron James. And so what they do is they teach ideas like humility. Yeah, you shouldn't think too highly of yourself. Whereas masters would have viewed pride as a virtue to some extent. Like, owning your whatever, your awesomeness. And they're like, the slaves are like, no, don't do that. That's actually a kind of sickness on your part. That's a kind of sin. It's a kind of wickedness. Right? So the slaves, what they do is they develop their own morality in order to bring down the strong to their own level. And so they come up with their own way of thinking about good and evil. They don't use good and bad. They use good and evil, he thinks. So they call anything that is weak, anything that is charitable, anything that is like them, they call good. And anything that is superior, that is strong, that is vital, they call it evil. They call it wicked. Right? This is not just turning your eyes away. This is condemning. Right? And so what they do, and this is what happened historically, Nietzsche thinks, is there takes place what he calls the slave revolt in morality, which is grounded in resentment, is grounded in a kind of hatred of anything that is superior, and it is a desire to bring everything down to your level. Right? Think liberal tolerance. Your ideas are just as good as mine. That's a way of bringing everything down to the same level. He thinks it's also a kind of nihilism. He thinks slave morality is a kind of nihilism because it says that everything is equal. Nothing really matters. Everything is just the same. Right? And it teaches people to say no to themselves, to hate themselves. Right? So what happens is this slave revolt in morality. The slaves can't just take up arms and defeat the masters because the masters would just kick their asses. He thinks. So what they do is they develop their own version of morality. And then they kind of like drip this into the ears. Is this Macbeth I'm referring to? I don't know. Drip the poison into the ears of the masters, and they whisper to them, pride is bad, charity is good, all of these kinds of things, to the point that the masters start to hate their own superiority. They turn on themselves. They begin to question themselves, and they think that something is wrong about them. So the slaves essentially teach the masters to hate themselves, so that the masters then will become sick, yes, and weak, just like the slaves themselves. So they teach the strong to hate themselves, to hate their own instincts for sex and for power and violence and these kinds of things, which Nietzsche thinks are natural desires, that we should actually use its energy to power us and to make our lives more beautiful. And instead, the slaves teach people to hate themselves, and therefore come down to the level of the slaves themselves. And this is what he calls the slave revolt in morality, and he thinks what's primarily responsible is the rise of Christianity. Yeah. So here you go. That is his basic view of morality. So not only can morality be different, but it was different in the past, and therefore he wants to say it could be different in the future. So one last remark before we end this section. A lot of people treat Nietzsche as if he's a kind of reactionary, which is to say that he wants to go back to the past. I think that's the wrong way to read him. He's not wanting to go back to this old master morality way of thinking. I don't think he wants to go back. He wants to go forward. He is, in a sense, a progressive thinker. He is very much looking forward. We're going to talk about this more in the next segment when we talk about the death of God, but he is definitely forward-looking. He doesn't want to return to the old morality. What he wants us to do is to develop a new morality. He does think that slave morality makes us sick. It makes us weak. It makes us into nihilists because it teaches us to hate ourselves and to hate the world. Right? It's the masters, it's energetic, joyful people who say yes to life. It's the slaves, the weak people who say no to life. And since slave morality makes us weak, it turns us into nihilists and gives us hopelessness and meaninglessness. And what we need to do is we need to shed slave morality and we need to create a new kind of morality, not go back, but go forward to something new, right? So he's not going to just throw out every aspect of slave morality. It's like, slaves say that stealing is bad. He's going to say that stealing is good. Like, he's not so simplistic and stupid, but he does want to say that what we need is for people to come up with different values, to come up with their own ways of living, and so then we can determine which values we should adopt and which values we should not. We need to be experimenters. That's kind of the idea. Yeah, look forward, not backward. That's Nietzsche. All right, on to the fun stuff. At least the stuff I regard as fun. So let's talk about Nietzsche's idea that God is dead. God is dead. So this is probably his most famous phrase, other than maybe what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. There's been movies made about this kind of stuff. The evangelical God is not dead. That is definitely a reference to Nietzsche. I'm actually going to start by reading you this passage. This is also from, like the other passage I read you, this is also from the book The Gay Science. It is a phenomenal work. I highly recommend reading it. Although be aware that he writes in an aphoristic style, so he writes in these little paragraphs and their section numbers. So it's not just like one long prose essay. In fact, I think that makes it in some ways more interesting. You can read one of these little paragraphs and you'll like think about it for a couple hours, that kind of thing. This passage is one of the most famous passages in all of Nietzsche. It's again the Gay Science, section 125. I'm not going to read the whole thing; it's too long, but I'll read the part that's most relevant to us. So here's what he says: God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And that question, that rhetorical question at the end there, the implied answer to that question is yes. Must we ourselves not become gods? And he thinks yes, we should ascend the mountain and we should become gods ourselves. That's what he thinks. Okay, so very, very interesting passage. What the hell is going on here? First of all, I want to say that Nietzsche is not preaching atheism. For one thing, if God exists, God can't die, obviously, right? So we can't like ascend Mount Olympus or whatever and stab God to death. So we didn't kill God in that sense. He's also not preaching atheism in the sense that he doesn't want everybody to be like him. Like that would be a bizarre thing for him to do. His whole point is he wants people to champion different kinds of things. And in fact, in the Antichrist, if you read the relevant passages, he says again, he hates Christianity, and like 95% of what he has to say about Christianity is extremely negative. But then every once in a while he'll say just really brilliant, beautiful things positive about Christianity, and he thinks that the kind of life that Jesus lived, he says, is possible for men even today. He says, right? And he means that in a positive, and maybe not a purely positive sense. He's too nuanced for that, but in some sense in a positive sense, because he says that Jesus never said no to anything. So he's not a nihilist. He never says no to anything. But on the other hand, he says Jesus never said yes to anything either. He seems to think that Jesus was kind of like a strung out hippie. Something like that. He was high all the time. He's like, hey man, free love. Something like that, I think, is how he viewed Jesus. But he doesn't want everybody to be like him. He's not like, yo, be an atheist. God is dead. You should believe that God is dead yourself. For one thing, it's important to note that in this passage, if you read the whole passage, this person who is speaking this, he's just telling a story in this passage, and he says there's a madman who comes down from the mountain and says this. And he says this madman who's talking about God is dead, he is talking to the villagers from this village that he's just making up. This madman comes down from the mountain and is talking to these villagers who are themselves atheists, is what Nietzsche says. Who are themselves atheists. So this is not the madman atheist preaching atheism to Christians and saying abandon your God is dead. He's not saying that. He's talking to other atheists, which is really, really interesting, right? So he doesn't want other people to be like himself. And in fact, he's not even addressing himself to religious people and saying that they should abandon their faith. That's not what he's doing. All right? So what does he mean when he's talking about the death of God? First of all, I think that he believes that God has no cachet for us anymore. God is unbelievable to us. He doesn't think that people can really sincerely believe in God nowadays. This would be an excellent topic for a reflection this time. I'm curious if you think that's true. Do you think that people can really sincerely believe in God these days, or do you think that people are in some sense lying to themselves when they believe in God? So Nietzsche believes, though, that God is unbelievable to us nowadays. And why does he think this is true? Nietzsche thinks there are two primary reasons. First of all, God is dead in the sense that God has become unbelievable to us in the sense that Christianity killed God. Yeah, he thinks that Christianity is responsible for the death of God. So Christianity killed God by, on the one hand, making myths like that history is the story of God's activity God's activity in time, that God exists and that there's a heaven after we die and all this kind of stuff, right? And so Christianity tells all these stories. Like God, history is just God working in time. God has a plan for your life. God has a plan for history. There is a God. There's a heaven. Then Nietzsche thinks this is all just storytelling. This is just making shit up. But at the same time, Christianity instills in people almost a pathological fear of lying. So it created almost a pathological desire for truth and truthfulness. And Nietzsche says, in part, and there's historical research to bear this out, that Christianity is in large part responsible for the birth of modern science, for example. So Christianity has historically tried to figure out what the truth is. So Christianity is, European institutions, not exclusively European. I mean, Muslim Arabic nations were doing their own kind of research. China and India had their own kind of research going on. But universities in Europe, and especially in England, eventually give birth to biblical criticism. They give birth to history departments. They give birth to modern sciences and these kinds of things. So people have this, in Christian nations, have this intense desire to just figure out what the truth is, to know the truth, and to not be deceived, to not believe in lies, to not tell lies or to believe in lies. And so they give rise to Christianity. He thinks gives rise to all these forms of intellectual inquiry, and these forms of intellectual inquiry over time, he thinks, end up attacking and dissolving Christianity itself. Right? So Christianity says, the Bible is a story of God's activity in time. And then Christianity simultaneously gives birth to biblical criticism, which is criticism of the Bible, literary criticism of the Bible. What does biblical criticism say? Oh, this is all just bullshit. These are just stories that human beings made up. Christianity says that, God is active in the universe, right? Then Christianity also gives birth to natural sciences. What do the natural sciences say? Can't find God here. Yeah, and so on. So Christianity tells these myths, but then it also gives birth to these fields of inquiry because it creates this intense loathing of lying and being deceived. And so it tells these myths, but then gives rise to the forms of intellectual inquiry, which eventually dissolve the myths themselves. And eventually, over time, he thinks that Christianity, by birthing these forms of intellectual inquiry, dissolves its own foundations by making people skeptical of belief in God himself. That's crazy. It's a really, really, really interesting thesis, right? Incredibly interesting thesis. So Christianity just kills itself by telling myths and then developing intellectual inquiry, which then undermines the very myths that it was telling. And so now nobody can believe in God anymore. He thinks, that's an interesting theory. So that's the first reason why belief in God has been unbelievable to us. The second reason why God has become unbelievable to us, and this is the first thing I just said is well-grounded in Nietzschean scholarship. The second one is a little bit more me, but I do think I find support for it in Nietzsche's thought. I think that he thinks that slave revolt morality and Christianity, by trying to level everything out and creating this impulse for equality, for everything being equal, that too has destroyed our belief in God. Because God, as he says in this passage, was the mightiest and holiest thing that the world has ever known, right? This idea of God as Yahweh, as being a supreme deity, was the greatest thing that we ever conceived of. But then we don't like anything being superior to us. Again, this is part of how Christianity kind of undermined itself, is it hates anything that's above us. We don't like God telling us what to do, right? So what we did is we took Yahweh, who was this powerful God, read the Hebrew scriptures, who's storming on mountaintops and telling the Jewish people to essentially eliminate all of the people who live in Canaan, right? This is the kind of stuff that Yahweh is telling people to do. And this is like a supreme, powerful deity. And basically what Nietzsche thinks is we took that being, and we didn't like that being, because that deity is scary to us and is above us and superior to us and tells us to do stuff and pushes us around. We don't like that. So then we turn Yahweh into Jesus. Who's just like, be nice. And we're like, yeah, I know, right? So basically we took, nowadays God doesn't mean anything because God is superfluous, right? You go to church and what they tell you, be nice to people. And you're like, yeah, I already knew that, right? Because we swim in slave morality. So basically what we did is we turned God into a cheap image of ourselves. This is what we did, right? God used to be powerful, used to be like awe-inspiring and terrifying. And then what we did is we turned God into like a white liberal male, Jesus, who just says, be nice to other people. And you're like, yeah, I already know that, so why should I even go to church? Because it's just like useless. They're just telling me stuff that I already know because the God that we now believe in is just a cheap imitation of our weak-ass selves. This is basically what Nietzsche's saying. Our God is now weak because we're weak. That's basically what happened. So we brought God down to our level. So God used to be terrifying and inspiring and challenging to us, but now God is no longer that. All right? So now God is unbelievable to us. And so what happens now? So Nietzsche, again, not wanting to go back. He is not saying we need to go back to believing Yahweh or something like that. He is okay. I think my position on this, other philosophers disagree, is my position on this is that Nietzsche, I think, would actually be open to certain kinds of deities, like a god of life. He thinks that the Christian God is a god of death, is a god of weakness, and literally a god of death, is crucified and this kind of stuff. I think he would be okay with like a Dionysian kind of god, the god of wine and sex and dancing. I think Nietzsche would be like, yeah, I'm okay with that. I think he would be okay with a deity like that, one that inspires us, that that it teaches us to embrace life. But in any case, now that God is dead, basically he thinks that we really have two options. We can kind of like hide our heads in the sand and say no to life and embrace nihilism and just give up and hold on to traditional slave morality. But he thinks the cool thing is that God was kind of like the defender, the keystone of slave morality. And now that God is dead, he thinks this is why the person who comes down to the mountain is talking to other atheists, not to Christians, and is saying God is dead, God is dead. And the people in the town respond like, this person has lost their minds. Like, what are you talking about? And what Nietzsche is trying to say is, you atheists have not grasped the significance of the death of God. Now that God is dead, we should be revisiting, reevaluating our ideas about morality. But Nietzsche was saying that was not happening at the time. You have these atheists like Schopenhauer or John Stuart Mill, who we discussed, right? He's a utilitarian. You have these atheists who basically continue teaching slave morality. They continue to teach that we should be nice to people who are sick, and compassion and pity and these kinds of things. And Nietzsche is saying, no, now that God is dead, it's like God was like the keystone, right? You've seen an arch, Pennsylvania Keystone State. If you've seen an arch, the keystone is the last thing there, and it holds the entire arch in place. Now that God is dead, the arch should collapse, right? We should allow it to collapse, and we should allow slave morality to disappear because it's making us sick and it's making us weak. And instead, what we should do is look forward to the future, cast off slave morality, ascend the mountain ourselves, right? Because God in the Old Testament, God in the Hebrew Scriptures was the being who decided what's good or bad. Now we need to ascend the mountain ourselves and to decide for ourselves what is good or what is bad, right? So he really wants us to, again, to coming back to this idea, he wants us to be experimenters, he wants us to be explorers, he wants us to try out new things, all right? So one more section about Nietzsche, we're going to talk about the Übermensch and eternal recurrence. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the Übermensch and eternal recurrence. So what is the Übermensch, or Übermenschen, plural? So there's lots of debates about this, like there is with everything with Nietzsche, about what the hell Nietzsche is talking about with the Übermensch. Some people, like I think the Nazis, thought that this was just going to be like kind of like the master race. But my view on this, and I think it's well grounded in Nietzsche's own work, is that the Übermensch is not a kind of human; it's the being that comes after humanity. So this is a post-human kind of being. This is, I think, what Nietzsche has in mind. So Übermensch is a being that comes after humanity. That's kind of vague, though, so maybe we can say a little bit more. But in order to be able to do that, we need to talk about eternal recurrence. So the other thing I can say about the Übermensch is that the Übermensch is a being that would glory in, that would enjoy eternal recurrence. I think that's actually a very accurate statement. The Übermensch is a being that would glory in or would enjoy eternal recurrence. But in order to understand what that means, we have to understand eternal recurrence. So Nietzsche talks about eternal recurrence in a number of places, but he never fully develops it or gives it a full articulation in any of his published works. In fact, where he talks about it most is in his notebooks, and there it's not complete. And there's at least two very different ways that he talks about eternal recurrence. So my point is that it's evident that he first never articulated his final views on eternal recurrence, and then secondly, a lot of this was just like rattling around in his head, and he really couldn't quite pin down what he himself actually thought about it. So there are a couple passages in the published works where he doesn't mention it, and so we're going to return again to the work of Gay Science and read section 341. I'm going to read part of this to you, and then we're going to talk briefly about eternal recurrence and then your reaction to it. So here Nietzsche writes, Gay Science, section 341. This section is entitled "The Greatest Weight." He says, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live it once more and innumerable times more. There will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life you will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider, and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment, and I myself, this eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, you speck of dust." All right. So he's envisioning a demon, he says, stealing into you when you're lonely and saying this to you. What if this life that you now live, you're going to live it on repeat, over and over and over again? And the demon is saying, it's interesting to put it in the mouth of a demon, but the demon is saying everything, every tiny bit of your life will be repeated in the same succession that you're now experiencing. And even to the point that the demon gestures up to a spider crawling up probably like whatever in the corner of the room or something like that. Right. So every little thing will be identical. And so the question is, it's kind of like, what is your reaction to this, right? So he actually, so Nietzsche continues, and he writes, "Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experimented a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and I have never heard anything more divine? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps even crush you. The question in each and everything, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more reverently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal?" So that's the end of the passage. So he asks, what is your reaction to hearing about this idea of eternal recurrence, this idea that you will live your life on infinite repeat? Will you throw yourself down on the ground and be like, no, anything but that? Or what he asks, or have you experienced a moment so divine where you say, yes, I want to live my life over and over again, exactly as I've experienced it this time. I want to live it over and over again on infinite repeat. Would you say yes? And he says, how does this idea affect you? What would you have to change about yourself to put yourself in a position where this is what you would actually crave? He says, like devoutly, this is what you would want. What kinds of changes would you have to make to yourself that you would want to say, yes, give me that. I want to live my life again and again on infinite repeat. So eternal recurrence, he is here talking about you living your own life on infinite repeat, but in the Wealth of Power, he seems to think that the universe as a whole will actually repeat itself over and over and over again, and your life in that universe will repeat itself over and over again infinitely. So the universe is going to be in the cycle, infinite cycle, and so your own life will be on an infinite cycle. But this is not like the movie Groundhog Day where you can do it differently the second time around. The idea is that you experience the same thing over and over again. Students usually ask at this point, they ask, well, would you be aware of the fact that this is, not the first time you've experienced this? Would you be cognizant of the fact that you're experiencing this on an infinite loop? I think the answer to that question has to be yes. So Nietzsche never specifies this, but I think the answer has to be yes, because otherwise there's no real punch to this question of would you want to live your life on an infinite repeat? Because if the answer to the question, would you be aware of your other, the other times you've experienced this? If the answer to that is no, then it's like, well, then right now, this would be like my 10 billionth time through my life, but I don't know that. So like, what difference would it make if I do it again? I won't know. It'll just be like I'm experiencing it the first time. So I think you actually have to be aware of it to some extent. But in any case, would you want to live it again? This is the question. So the big question, of course, is the one that Nietzsche asks, which is, what is your reaction to this? Would you want to live your life on infinite repeat? And this is, again, this would be a supreme question for, this is a real philosophical question, because this will get you to examine your own life. Again, which assignment you do, reflection assignments you can do on a different aspect of Nietzsche. You don't have to do this part, because this is almost invariably going to be getting somewhat personal in order to answer in any degree of detail. But I hope, regardless of whether you do the reflection assignment, you actually ask yourself this question and actually take some time to sit down and to think about this. Would I want to live my life on an infinite repeat, yes or no? I think most of us, I suspect that most of us would want to say yes to some parts of our life, but no to other parts of our life. At least that's how I feel. I experienced some really awesome things and some really terrible things. So I'm like, I fell off my roof once. That wasn't fun. I don't really want to do that again. That was not cool. I collapsed a lung once. I don't really want to do that again. My college girlfriend breaking up with me. I just call her college girlfriend now. We were like best friends for like 3 years in high school, and then like dated for like 3.5 years in college, and then she kicked my ass at the